Over the years, we've seen some incredible forwards. Rewind 100 years, and there's the likes of Jimmy McGrory, British football's greatest ever goal scorer. Forward a bit and there's Ferenc Puskas, Eusebio, Pele, Van Basten, Cruyff, Jorginho, Garrincha, Maradona, Ronaldo again, Messi, Mbappe, Papin. I could keep going on and on because I've genuinely randomly picked some historical greats and have missed out on some of football's best ever players. But that's because I want to focus on one man who's playing right now and will almost certainly find himself in a list like I'd named in the near future. If you've seen the title and thumbnail, you should know exactly who I'm talking about. And so heads up, I'm about to make one very bold statement about him. Erling Haaland will go down as one of, if not the, most dominant striker in footballing history. Take a moment to comprehend how I phrased that, as I know it's a very complicated topic to speak on, but I genuinely think is the truth. See, what does dominant actually mean? For example, if you've ever watched someone like Che Adams, you'll know he's often a complete handful for defenders and can dominate a game if he's on it. But at the same time, Pep Guardiola's Barcelona side were one of the most predictable teams in the world on the face of it, as you always knew one player was never going to drive 20 or 30 yards with a ball, well, other than Messi, as Guardiola's principles were completely down to quick passing. But yet they still dominated European football for nearly half a decade. And so how can two subjects, completely different in every way, both be described as dominant? One is an inconsistent player, and the other is one of the most consistent teams in football history. Yet as I mentioned, you wouldn't be incorrect to describe them both as being dominant. So what does dominant mean? Well, it's defined in the dictionary as simply having power and influence over others, which is possibly why it's so hard to nail one thing down as making you dominant, particularly in football, as the definition of the word is simply so open. On screen now, I've thought of various ways in which a player or team can be dominant in football. Firstly, there's physical dominance, i.e. Che Adams. Secondly, there's dominance through continued success, and even dominance through technical brilliance, mentality, and even tactically. Each of these cover different aspects of the game, whilst also linking into each other, and most of the footballing greats dominated through two or more of these aspects. But what happens if you combine them all to make the supposed most dominant player of all time? Well, I think you create Erling Braut Haaland. Now before I go any further in this video, I just want to make one thing clear. Being the most dominant footballer does not make you the greatest footballer. And so sorry if I clickbaited you with the thumbnail, the game is in fact the game. I just wanted to draw in as many people as possible, so I hope I didn't cause any offence. Back onto the video then. If I had to describe Erling Haaland in the most creative but also relatable way, I'd say he's like if Adriano and the Terminator had a baby, and then gave it a copious amount of crap. Apologies for that glitch. What I was trying to say is that if you gave the baby a copious amount of cracked footballing ability, there was definitely no other ending to that sentence I had in mind. But to understand why Erling Haaland is so good, and why I think he'll be so dominant, we need to rewind to the start of it all for the man formerly nicknamed the Striking Viking. On the 21st of July in the year 2000, Erling Haaland, Norway's future star man, was born in, Leeds. This would of course be due to the fact that Erling's father, Alf Inge Haaland, had been a Premier League player since 1993, having just left Leeds a few weeks before Erling was born. Funnily enough, Erling Haaland has said it would be his dream to play for Leeds before he retires, despite the fact he would never have seen his father play at Elland Road. Of course, in a huge example of foreshadowing, Alfie Haaland had left Leeds to join Man City in the year 2000, where his most iconic moment would be in a Manchester derby, in which he would be victim of an absolutely awful tackle from Roy Keane, which would see the Irishman be sent off. Although, contrary to popular belief, this tackle did not actually end Alfie Haaland's career. In fact, he actually got up, played the remainder of the game, and then would start the next 2 games of club and country. It would actually be an injury to his left knee that would cause him problems, where despite surgery in the summer of 2001, he would be forced into an early retirement and a move back to Norway. Obviously, at the age of 3, Erling Haaland would move back to Norway with his parents to the town of Bryne, which is somehow younger than Erling Haaland himself, with it only having been established as a town in 2001, the same year Steven Gerrard won Young Player of the Year for the Premier League. The population of Bryne is just 12,000, and so with not much to do, a young Haaland turned to the one thing he loved the most for entertainment: football. He would spend hours every day playing football, dominating the local scene. In fact, you can actually find footage of him online, absolutely killing it. He was just 5 years old when he would join the Bryne youth team and would spend 11 years in the academy before being given a professional deal aged just 16 at the time. He would spend his first season in senior football playing with the Bryne reserve team, where he would score a quite frankly frightening 18 goals in just 14 games. The thing is with Haaland, he'd been very fortunate with the cards he was dealt with at birth, and is truly a genetic monster. As I mentioned, his dad was of course a footballer, And as many of you will know, he also has two first cousins which are also professionals, the younger of which, Haland, just 18 himself, having scored 7 goals in 8 games for Brighton 2. It's truly the definition of a footballing family. Except you might be surprised to hear that these are Erling Haaland's maternal cousins, coming from the side of Marita Braut, his mother. But she was far from unathletic herself. Erling's mother Gry was a heptathlete, one of the most grueling sports in the world, only furthering the monster genetics I mentioned Erling Haaland had. When you're 6'5", absolutely rapid, strong, powerful, and genuinely just an incredible athlete, with 2 unbelievably athletic parents, you'd of course be destined to physically dominate your opponents, like Erling does. In fact, when I mentioned the Adriano comparison earlier, comparing Haaland to one of the strongest, most powerful forwards of the century is disrespectful if anything. Instead of having the flair Adriano possessed, Erling instead bodies those around him to get a shot on goal. For the few seasons in which Adriano was in his prime at Inter Milan, he was described as one of the most dominant footballers on the planet. But if you compare that to Erling Haaland and his sporting DNA, you have a very scary footballer for the world to deal with. Back onto his early career, and he joined Molde in 2017, scored a load more goals, and then joined RB Salzburg in January 2019, which is where I think most people watching this would have first heard of him. Haaland wouldn't even be Salzburg's starting striker for his first half season at the club, but going into the 2019-20 season, he'd shown enough development to earn himself that starting spot. By just the 17th of December, he'd scored in 6 consecutive league games, including 3 hat-tricks, as well as another hat-trick on his Champions League debut against Genk. Focusing on this Champions League campaign, he would score a goal against Liverpool, as well as 3 against Napoli over both fixtures, and a final goal against Genk, before failing to bag against Liverpool in what would be his final game for Salzburg, as the club were eliminated from the Champions League. In just half a season in Austria, Haaland would score 5 hat-tricks, with 16 goals coming in just 11 league starts, as well as 8 goals in 6 Champions League games, where they'd be drawn into the group of death. Obviously, following this he would join Dortmund, in which he'd scored an absolute ton of goals, but I won't bother covering it too much as I'm sure you all know enough about it. Although there is one thing I wanted to mention. It was at Salzburg and then Dortmund, where Haaland's technical ability improved significantly, and is a part of his game which I think is massively underrated. He's always been described as a pure goal scorer, who can't really do anything but put the ball in the back of the net, but one aspect of his game which is hugely underrated is his hold-up play. You've never tended to notice it too much at Man City or even at Dortmund, as in Manchester he plays very little role in the build-up, with his job purely being to score goals. And at Dortmund, the counter-attacking style they played very rarely showed off this part of his game, but when you watch the rare moments in which he has to hold the ball up waiting for an opening for one of his teammates, you can see he's most definitely not subpar technically. Also, for a man of his size and build, his dribbling ability is actually very impressive. He's no Zlatan, but can you name many other 6'5" big men who are able to dribble around an entire team? I thought not. The fact is, these days people tend to mix up technical skill with just doing tricks and flair, but really it's so much more than that. And maybe we should start focusing on different aspects of a player's technicality when describing their ability on the ball. See, since joining City, Haaland has averaged just 24.8 touches per 90 in the league, but when pretty much every single one of these touches is involved in a big chance, you need to actually take a further look into why that is. And it's not just solely down to his position and incredible teammates, although they do certainly help. If we go back to earlier in this video, where I mentioned different ways I thought a player can dominate, we can see that not only does he dominate physically, but he also does have a relatively high level of technical skill, particularly excelling in certain areas, like a surprisingly great first touch for a big man. Now, on to mentality, and I don't think there's a single player outside of PSG in the world right now who is able to have as much of an effect on the mindset of an opponent as Erling Haaland does. The fact is, time and time again this season, we've seen defenders come up against Haaland looking defeated before the match has even started. And when he's capable of mixing gamesmanship into his game, as well as pure footballing brilliance, I think it's fair to say he dominates games mentally as well. Haaland often makes smart fouls, out of the view of referees, which get into the head of opponents and forces them to lose composure. And it's remarkable to see the outcome of when a defender loses his head in one of the rare instances in which a striker will be taller and bigger than them. They'll either go far too aggressive and end up giving away fouls, or seep into their shells and allow him to take full control of the battle. Both scenarios leave Haaland out on top. In fact, one of the only other players I can remember that was so smart at this mental game was David Silva, who would constantly give away fouls in the Prem, and yet is never thought of as a dirty opponent due to his intuition and the perfect timing in which to commit them. David Silva also links to my next point, which is the fact that at Manchester City, Erling Haaland is going to see a lot of success, another factor in dominance. Bar Bayern Munich and PSG, I can't think of a single team in Europe who've dominated domestic football as much as Man City have since Pep Guardiola's arrival 6 years ago. And so, with a minimum of 1 or 2 trophies a season to add to his currently somewhat empty CV, Haaland has found a cheat code to go down as a great. And having seen his technical ability improve at Dortmund and in the Red Bull system, it will surely be his tactical understanding which will only improve further under the tutoring of Pep Guardiola. As I mentioned, Erling Haaland is already an incredibly smart player, but with Pep as his manager, his understanding of how games will unfold in front of him is just going to improve even further. And I think this is what will be the factor that pushes him over the line down the years in terms of being remembered for his dominance. In case you weren't aware, Haaland has made it clear he wants to prove himself in all top 5 leagues, and so if he's able to read the game better than anybody in said leagues, once he moves to them, it will be a matter of a season or 2 before he's won everything there is to win domestically. And as well as the advantage of his physical attributes, he'll be truly unstoppable. So on to the final point of this video. I sadly do think it's nearly impossible for Haaland to ever be remembered as the GOAT, even if he manages to prove it in all of Europe's big leagues, simply because there will forever be the stigma of him being just a big man who scores goals, whether it's fair or not. But as I mentioned constantly throughout this video, he may well just go down as the most dominant and even the greatest striker of all time. If we take a look at just out and out strikers, the only players that come to mind as potentially being seen as better by the general public than Haaland would be Van Basten and Ronaldo, both of which were technically superior to the Norwegian, but also faced huge injury problems throughout their careers. And that's where I think it'll be make or break for Haaland. At Dortmund, Haaland faced numerous small injuries a season, which would prevent him from battling with Lewandowski for individual awards. And it's these individual awards where it can be make or break for somebody's legacy. If Haaland is always being pipped to the Ballon d'Or by someone like Mbappe due to the fact he's missed 10 to 15 games each season, then alongside the fact he's very unlikely to see any international success, I can see him very easily being cast aside in future debates, alongside someone like Romario, who is one of the greatest strikers of all time, yet never seems to be spoken about enough these days. There's no way we can predict the future, but if Erling Haaland can stay injury-free, I can't see a world in which he doesn't reach his full potential in each of these categories, and therefore be remembered as the most dominant and greatest striker of all time. Thank you guys for watching. I'm sure I did forget an absolute load of great players when bringing up the past in this video, but I'm sure most of you will be able to see the point I was making. Please follow all my social media, which will be linked in the description, and most importantly, like, subscribe and comment if you enjoyed. But for now, thanks for watching and enjoy your day.